He should have closed the door the moment he saw her. But by sunrise, no man within 50 miles would dare step foot on his land. Before we go on, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or country. And if you believe some debts don't come with words, stay with me. Now back to the story. The wind that night carried dust like it had something to hide, dry and restless, whispering against the boards of Ethan Cole's cabin as he drove his shovel into the hard ground, the hole in front of him barely 3 feet deep, too small for a man, too small for anything that should have been buried alone. He paused only once, leaning on the handle, staring at the worn patch of earth as if it might speak back, but it didn't. It never did. Out here, silence was the only thing that stayed loyal. 12 miles from the nearest town. No fences, no neighbors, just land and memory, and Ethan preferred it that way, until the knock came. Soft at first, like a mistake, he ignored it, lifted the shovel. Again, then it came once more, weaker, slower, the kind of sound that didn't belong to the wind. He turned his head slightly, listening, the kind of stillness that comes from years of knowing when something is wrong settled into his bones. He stepped toward the door, boots pressing into dry dirt, hand hovering near the latch, not rushing, never rushing. When he pulled it open, she fell forward into the frame, a woman, young but worn by the road, her dress torn at the edges, dust clinging to her skin, one hand wrapped tight around a small leather pouch, the other bracing her weight as she struggled to stay upright, her breathing shallow, controlled like she was trying not to make a sound. And then he saw it, the curve beneath her dress, unmistakable. She was pregnant. Her eyes lifted to his, dark and sharp despite the exhaustion, and for a second neither of them moved. Not a word passed, just the wind slipping between them, carrying the scent of leather, sweat, and something else. Something like sage and rain. "They're coming," she said finally, her voice low, steady, but threaded with something deeper than fear. Not panic, not pleading, something closer to certainty. Ethan didn't answer. His eyes moved past her, scanning the open land beyond. Nothing yet, just the long stretch of desert under a sky that hadn't decided if it would storm. He could close the door now, could step back into the life he'd built from quiet and distance. No questions, no trouble, just another stranger passing through like dust on the wind. But the way she held that pouch, tight enough to whiten her knuckles, the way she stood without asking, without begging, it pulled at something he'd buried. Deeper than that shallow grave outside, something that hadn't spoken in years. He stepped aside, just enough. She didn't hesitate, crossed the threshold without a word, and the moment she did, the air inside the cabin changed, not warmer, not safer, just heavier, like something unseen had followed her in. Ethan closed the door behind her, the wood settling with a quiet finality. He poured water into a tin cup, set it on the table. She didn't reach for it right away. Instead, she moved to the corner, back to the wall, eyes still watching him like she was measuring distance, risk, meaning. "Who's coming?" he asked after a moment, his voice flat, not demanding, just placing the question where it belonged. She shook her head once, not in refusal, but in restraint. "Men who don't ask twice," she said, her fingers tightening around the pouch, "and men who don't leave empty-handed." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint sound across the distance, so soft most would miss it, but Ethan didn't. Hooves, far off, but moving steady, deliberate. He glanced toward the window, then back at her, and in that brief silence something unspoken settled between them. Not trust, not yet, but an understanding. Whatever had reached his door that night wasn't leaving quietly, and whatever was coming already knew exactly where to find them. The sound of hooves did not rush. It settled, steady and patient, like men who already believed the outcome belonged to them. Ethan stood by the window without touching the curtain, just enough space to watch the horizon through the thin crack in the wood. 5 riders, maybe more behind them, their silhouettes cutting across the pale stretch of land, not hiding, not hurrying. That told him everything he needed to know. These were not men chasing blindly. They were men who had tracked, measured, and arrived exactly where they intended to be. Behind him, the woman had not moved far from the corner, her breathing slower now, but still guarded, her hand never leaving that leather pouch. "You can leave through the back," Ethan said without turning, his voice even, like he was talking about the weather. She did not answer right away, and when she did, it was not what he expected. "They will follow," she said quietly. "They always do." There was no fear in her tone, just a simple truth stated like a fact that had repeated itself too many times. Ethan shifted his weight, the floor creaking beneath his boots. "Then you stay," he said, just as flat, as if the decision had already been made before the question existed. The wind pressed against the cabin again, carrying with it the faint jingle of metal and leather from outside. Closer now, the riders slowing, spreading just enough to cover angles without saying a word. Discipline like that did not come from chance. Ethan reached for the rifle resting against the wall, but did not lift it. His hand stayed there for a moment, resting on the wood, then dropped. Not yet, not unless it needed to be. Behind him, he heard movement. The woman stepping forward, not toward the door, but toward the table. She picked up the tin cup, drank once, then set it down with careful control, like even small sounds mattered. "If they ask," she said, her eyes lifting to meet his for the first time without hesitation, "you tell them nothing." Ethan gave a slight nod, not agreement, just acknowledgement. Outside a voice finally broke the silence. Calm, practiced, used to being heard. "Evening," the man called, though the light was already fading toward night. "We are looking for someone." Ethan opened the door before they could knock, not wide, just enough to stand in the frame, his body filling the space. The 5 men sat on their horses about 20 yards out, spread in a loose arc, rifles visible but not raised. Their leader sat straight, reins loose in one hand, the other resting casually against his thigh. A man who knew how to wait. "You are a long way from town," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the distance without strain. The leader smiled faintly, not friendly, not unfriendly, just measuring. "So are you," he replied, his gaze flicking once to the cabin behind Ethan, then back. "We are not here for trouble," he continued. "We are here for a woman. She came through this land not long ago." Ethan did not answer right away, letting the silence stretch just enough to make it clear he would not be hurried. The wind shifted again, brushing dust along the ground between them. "Lots of people pass through," Ethan said finally, his tone unchanged. The man's smile thinned, just a fraction. "Not like this one," he said, leaning forward slightly in the saddle. "She carries something that does not belong to her." Inside the cabin, the woman's grip on the pouch tightened, though she made no sound. Ethan felt it anyway, the tension pulling at the air behind him. "And if she did?" Ethan said, his eyes steady on the man. "What makes you think she would come here?" The question hung there, not aggressive, just placed carefully. The kind of question that forced a man to show more than he intended. The leader studied him for a long moment, then glanced toward the horizon as if considering something beyond the moment. "Because men like you," he said slowly, "have a habit of opening doors they should leave closed." A faint shift moved through the riders behind him, not threatening, just ready. The kind of readiness that did not need to be spoken. Ethan did not move, did not reach for the rifle, did not step back. He just stood there, filling the doorway like it was the only line that mattered. "You should turn around," Ethan said, not louder, not sharper, just certain. The leader tilted his head slightly, studying him again, then let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh if there had been humor in it. "We will be here a while," he said, settling deeper into the saddle. Morning tends to change a man's mind. Ethan's gaze did not leave his, "Not mine," he replied, and somewhere behind him, unseen, the woman closed her eyes for just a second, like she had heard those words before, or had been waiting for them all along. The night settled in slow, like it had nowhere else to be, and the men outside did not leave. They shifted their horses once or twice, spoke in low tones that never quite carried, but they stayed, patient as stone, and that was the part that mattered. Men who rushed made mistakes. Men who waited made decisions. Ethan stepped back from the doorway and closed it without a sound, the latch falling into place like it belonged there. He did not lock it. There was no point in locking wood against men who had already decided to stay. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, casting long shadows that moved across the walls with every flicker. The woman stood near the table, still holding that pouch like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "They will not leave," she said, not asking, just stating it the way someone does when they have seen the same ending more than once. Ethan nodded once, reaching down to add a piece of wood to the fire. The crackle filled the space between them. Then wait, he said, simple, steady, as if waiting was something he understood better than most. She watched him for a moment, studying the way he moved, the way he did not ask questions that would not change anything, and something in her shoulders eased, just slightly, enough to notice if you were looking. You should not be here, she said after a while, her voice quieter now, less edge, more weight. Ethan did not look up. Neither should you, he replied, and that was the end of that. The wind pressed against the cabin again, stronger now, carrying the faint scent of rain somewhere far off, though the sky above them remained dry. Outside, a horse shifted, the soft thud of hooves against dirt marking time in a way that felt too steady, too deliberate, like a clock counting down to something neither of them could see yet. The woman finally moved from the corner, stepping closer to the fire, lowering herself slowly onto the chair as if every movement had to be measured. Her hand never left the pouch, even as she sat. What is in it? Ethan asked, not because he needed to know, but because the question had been there since. The moment she crossed his threshold, she did not answer right away, her eyes dropping to the worn leather, fingers tracing the edge like it carried more than what could be seen. A promise, she said finally, and something in the way she said it made the word feel heavier than it should have been. Ethan leaned back slightly, resting against the wall. Promises do not usually bring riders in the night, he said, his tone not accusing, just curious in the way a man gets when he knows there is more beneath the surface. She shook her head once, slow, deliberate. This one does, she replied, lifting her gaze to meet his again. And this one was not made by me. That caught his attention, just enough to shift his focus. Then who made it? He asked, but before she could answer, the sound outside changed, not louder, not closer, just different, like the air itself had shifted direction. Both of them felt it, the kind of change that does not need explanation. Ethan pushed off the wall and moved back toward the door, not opening it, just standing near it, listening. The men outside had gone quiet, completely quiet. No low voices, no shifting leather, nothing. And that kind of silence did not come from comfort. It came from awareness. The woman stood as well, one hand resting against the table for balance, the other still gripping the pouch. It is starting, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan glanced back at her. What is starting? He asked, but she did not answer, not with words. Her eyes moved past him, toward the horizon he could not yet see from where he stood. And for a moment, just a moment, there was something in her expression that looked like relief, not fear, not panic, but relief, like whatever she had been waiting for had finally decided to arrive. Outside, one of the riders spoke again, but this time his voice did not carry the same calm certainty. It was lower, tighter. You hear that? He said to someone unseen. Ethan held still, listening harder now, and there it was, faint at first, so faint it could have been mistaken for wind rolling over distant hills. But it was not wind, it was rhythm, many rhythms, layered, steady, moving across the land with purpose, not rushing, not scattered, but united. And as it grew just enough to be undeniable, the men outside shifted again, not forward this time, but back, just inches, just enough to show something had changed. Ethan did not move, did not reach for the rifle. He just stood there, feeling the ground beneath his boots in a way he had not in years, and behind him, the woman finally spoke again, her voice calm now, certain in a way it had not been before. They found us, she said. And for the first time since she arrived, it did not sound like a warning, it sounded like an answer. The sound grew slowly, not louder in force but deeper in meaning, like the land itself had decided to speak. Ethan opened the door this time, not wide, just enough to see past the men who had been waiting all night, and what he saw did not rush toward him. It did not charge or scatter. It arrived, line by line along the horizon, shapes forming out of the early gray light before sunrise, riders, dozens at first, then more behind them, then more beyond that, their silhouettes steady and upright. Horses moving at a measured pace, no dust kicked up in panic, no shouting carried on the wind, just presence, the kind that settled into the bones of anyone watching. The 5 men outside his cabin saw it too, their horses shifting uneasily now, heads turning, ears twitching. One of them pulled slightly on the reins without meaning to, as if instinct had already begun to speak before thought could catch up. That is not possible, one muttered under his breath, but it was, and it was happening. Right in front of them, the leader straightened in his saddle, trying to hold the same calm he had worn all night. But something in his posture tightened, not fear yet, but recognition, like a man who suddenly realized he had stepped into a place he did not understand. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, boots pressing into the dry wood, the morning air cooler now, carrying that same scent of distant rain mixed with leather and dust. Behind him the woman followed, slower, one hand braced against the doorframe, the other still holding the pouch. She did not look at the riders in front of the cabin. Her eyes went straight to the horizon, and for the first time since she had arrived, her shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in release. You knew they would come, Ethan said quietly, not accusing, just stating what had become clear. She nodded once. Not for me, she said, her voice steady now. For what I carry. The riders on the horizon continued to approach, their numbers becoming undeniable, 20, then 50, then more than Ethan cared to count, but they did not spread out. Like an attack, they moved in a line, unified, deliberate, and when they reached a certain distance, they stopped. All of them, at once, like a single thought had passed through them all. The silence that followed was heavier than anything the night had held. Even the wind seemed to pause. The 5 men in front of the cabin shifted again. This time there was no hiding it. One of them glanced back over his shoulder as if measuring distance. Another tightened his grip on the reins. The leader did not turn, but his eyes moved, calculating, adjusting. You should have told us, he said to Ethan, his voice lower now, less certain. Ethan did not answer right away, his gaze fixed on the line of riders ahead. You did not ask the right questions, he replied finally. The leader let out a slow breath, something between frustration and acceptance. What is she to them? He asked, and for the first time, Ethan did not look at the man when he answered. Not what? He said. Who? Behind him the woman took a step forward, her movement small but enough to draw every eye in that space. She did not speak, she did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, and the effect was immediate. From the line of riders in the distance, one figure began to move forward, older, slower, but carrying something the others did not, authority that did not need to be proven. The horse beneath him moved with careful steps, closing the space without hurry. When he stopped, he was still a good 30 yards away, far enough to show respect, close enough to be heard without strain. His eyes moved from the woman to Ethan, studying, weighing. Then he spoke, his voice calm, carrying across the quiet like it belonged. There, you gave her shelter, he said, not as a question. Ethan nodded once. The man inclined his head slightly, a gesture small but deliberate. Then you have done more than you know, he continued. The 5 men on horseback exchanged glances now. Uncertainty fully settled in their faces. The leader shifted in his saddle. We are taking her with us, he said, trying to reclaim control of something that had already moved beyond him. The older rider's gaze shifted to him slowly, not sharp, not aggressive, just present. No, he said, and it was not loud, not forceful, but it ended the conversation all the same. The air held still again, and in that stillness something became clear to everyone standing there. This land, this small stretch of dirt and wood and silence, no longer belonged to the rules those 5 men had brought with them, and they knew it, one by one. Without a word, their horses began to turn, not in panic, not in defeat, but in understanding, and Ethan stood there, watching it unfold, realizing that whatever had crossed his doorstep in the dark had not just changed the night. It had changed what this place meant to anyone who would ever look at it again. The dust had not settled yet when the last of the 5 riders turned away, their silhouettes shrinking against the pale stretch of morning, and no one spoke as they left, not a challenge, not a warning, just silence, the kind that follows when a man understands something he cannot fight. Ethan remained where he stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the horizon until the shapes of those men disappeared completely. Only then did he shift his gaze back to the line of riders who had come with the dawn. They had not moved, not one of them, still as stone, watching, waiting, not for permission, but for something else, something older than words, Beside him, the woman exhaled slowly, a breath she had been holding since before she reached his door, and for a moment the weight of the night seemed to lift from her shoulders, not gone, but lighter, like a storm that had finally passed beyond the ridge. The older rider who had spoken before nudged his horse forward again, closing the distance by a few yards. Never rushing, always measured. When he stopped, his eyes rested on Ethan, steady and clear. "You stood your ground," he said, not as praise, not as surprise, just recognition. Ethan gave a small nod. Nothing more. The man's gaze softened just enough to notice if you were looking for it. "That is not something many would do for a stranger," he continued. Ethan's jaw shifted slightly, the words settling somewhere deeper than he expected. "She was not a stranger when she crossed that door," he replied, and the truth of it hung there, simple, unadorned. The older man inclined his head again. Then his eyes moved to the woman, who now stepped forward fully into the light, her hand finally loosening around the pouch, not releasing it, but no longer gripping it like it might vanish. "It is time," the man said to her, his voice carrying a different weight now, something closer to familiarity. She nodded once, then turned to Ethan, and for a second the world narrowed to just the two of them. Standing there, the wind returning softly, brushing past like it had something to say, but chose not to. "You asked what was in this," she said, lifting the pouch slightly. Ethan's eyes followed the motion, then returned to her face. She opened it carefully, not fully, just enough for him to see inside, and what he saw was not gold, not weapons, not anything a man would chase across miles of land. It was cloth, worn and folded with care, wrapped around something smaller, something that held meaning beyond its size. She closed it again before he could ask. "It carries a promise made long before tonight," she said, her voice steady, and something in the way she spoke made it clear this was not a story she would tell all at once. Ethan let out a slow breath, the morning air filling his lungs with that mix of dust and something cleaner behind it. "And now," he said, "it is finished." She shook her head gently, a faint smile touching her lips, not bright, not light, but real. "No," she replied. "Now it begins." That caught him, not in confusion, but in the quiet way a man feels when something larger than him shifts direction. The older rider spoke again, his voice reaching them without effort. "Your name," he said, looking at Ethan. Ethan hesitated only a fraction, then answered, "Ethan Cole." The man repeated it once, as if committing it to memory, then nodded. "Ethan Cole," he said. "This land you stand on, it will not be crossed without thought again." The words were not a threat, not a promise in the way men usually spoke them, but something else, something that settled into the ground itself. The riders behind him remained still, but the weight of their presence carried that statement farther than any voice could. Ethan glanced out across the land he had lived on for years, the same dirt, the same sky, and yet it did not feel the same now. Something had changed, not in the land itself, but in what it meant. The woman stepped back slightly, closer to the older rider now, but her eyes remained on Ethan. "You gave shelter when you did not have to," she said, her voice softer now. "That is not forgotten where I come from." Ethan gave a small nod, unsure what to say to that, because out here, most things were forgotten the moment they passed. But this, whatever this was, did not feel like it would fade so easily. The older rider turned his horse slightly, the signal subtle but clear. The line of riders behind him began to shift as one, not leaving in haste, not dispersing, just turning, preparing to move as they had come. Together, the woman lingered 1 second longer, then stepped toward them, her hand still resting on the pouch, her shoulders straighter now, stronger, and as she mounted the horse that had been brought forward for her, she looked back one last time, not with fear, not with doubt, but with something that lingered between gratitude and something deeper, something that had not yet found its name. And Ethan stood there, watching as they began to move, the sound of hooves returning, not as a warning now, but as a quiet echo across the land. And as the distance between them grew, he realized that whatever had arrived at his door the night before had not just passed through his life. It had left something behind, something he could not see, but could feel in the way the morning air settled differently against his skin, like the land itself had taken notice. The land stayed quiet long after the riders disappeared, But it was not the same quiet Ethan had known before. It carried weight now, like something had been written into it without ink. He stood on the porch until the last echo of hooves faded into the distance, his eyes still on the horizon even when there was nothing left to see. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned back toward the cabin, the door still open behind him. The inside darker now that the fire had burned low. He stepped in and closed it gently, the wood settling into place like it had the night before. But it felt different in his hands, heavier somehow. He moved to the table where the tin cup still sat, untouched since she had last set it down, a faint mark of dust along its rim, the only sign she had been there at all. He reached out and turned it slightly, not for any reason, just to feel something solid under his fingers, something that had not changed. Outside, the wind shifted again, softer now, carrying none of the tension it had held through the night. Just open air moving across open land. Ethan glanced toward the corner where she had first stood, the shadow there now empty, but not forgotten. He could still see it, the way she had held herself, the way she had not asked, not begged, just stepped inside like she had already chosen her path, and he had chosen his without knowing it. He moved back toward the door and opened it again, stepping out onto the dirt, the morning sun rising slow over the ridge, casting long lines of light across the ground. And for a moment, everything looked the same as it had the day before, the same stretch of land, the same fence line in the distance, the same sky stretching wide and indifferent. But it was not the same. He could feel it in the way the air sat against his skin, in the way the silence no longer felt empty, but watched, not threatening, not heavy, just aware. Like the land itself had taken notice and would not forget. He walked a few steps out from the porch, boots pressing into the same ground he had worked for years, but each step felt measured now, like it mattered more than it had before. He stopped near the edge of the yard and looked down, the marks from the horses still visible in the dirt, overlapping patterns that told the story of the night in a way words never could. 5 sets from the men who had come first, then dozens more from those who had followed, all of them leading away now, leaving only the imprint behind. And Ethan stood there, reading it without trying, understanding more than he expected. Behind him, the cabin creaked softly as the wood adjusted to the warming air, and he turned back once more, his gaze settling on the doorway. The same doorway he had opened without knowing what would follow. The same doorway he could have closed. He rested his hand against the frame, fingers tracing the rough grain of the wood, and for a moment he saw it again, the way she had looked at him before stepping inside, not asking, not pleading, just knowing, like she had seen something in him he had not seen in himself for a long time. He let out a slow breath, the kind that carries more than air, and stepped back from the door, his eyes moving once more across the land, the sun climbing higher now, warming the ground, bringing with it the quiet hum of a day beginning. But even as the light spread, something remained, something that did not fade with the night, something that stayed rooted in that moment between darkness and dawn. And Ethan knew, without needing it said, that this place would not be seen the same way again, not by those who had come and left, not by those who might come after, and not by him. He turned and walked toward the shallow grave he had left unfinished, the shovel still standing where he had driven it into the dirt, the earth around it undisturbed since he had stepped away. He stopped beside it and looked down, the hole still small, still waiting, but it no longer held the same weight it had the night before. He reached for the shovel, gripping it firmly, then paused, his eyes lifting toward the horizon one last time. And in that quiet space between thought and action, something settled into place, not a decision, not a change, just a quiet understanding that whatever had begun with a knock on his door had not ended with the riders leaving. It had only moved forward, carried by something older than either of them, something that did not need to be explained to be felt. And as Ethan finally pulled the shovel free from the ground, he knew the land beneath his feet was no longer just his to live on. It was something more now, something that would remember him long after the dust had settled again. The sun had climbed halfway above the ridge when Ethan finally set the shovel aside, the dirt around the shallow grave still loose, unfinished, but no longer pressing on him the way it had the night before. He stood there for a long moment, one hand resting on the worn handle, eyes drifting across the open land as if expecting something to move out there again, but nothing did. Not yet, just the quiet stretch of morning settling into place. And still, that feeling remained, the one that had followed him since the riders left. Like the air itself was holding on to something unseen, he turned back toward the cabin, slower this time, not from hesitation, but from thought, each step measured without him realizing it. Inside, the space felt different now that it was empty again, the fire reduced to a low glow, the chair she had used pushed slightly away from the table, the faint imprint of her presence still lingering in ways that did not need to be seen to be understood. Ethan moved to the window, looking out across the same horizon he had watched all night. But something in him was no longer looking for trouble, it was waiting for meaning, and that was new. He did not like how unfamiliar it felt. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying with it a distant sound. Not hooves this time, not many, just one, steady and unhurried, approaching from the far edge of the land. Ethan did not reach for the rifle. He did not even move right away, just listened, letting the rhythm settle. Before he stepped back out onto the porch, the figure came into view slowly, a single rider against the wide stretch of dust and light. No rush, no tension, just purpose. As the distance closed, Ethan recognized the outline before the face, the same posture, the same measured pace, the older man. From the morning, riding alone now, when he reached the yard, he did not stop at a distance this time. He came closer, within 10 yards, then 5, before bringing the horse to a quiet halt. The animal lowered its head slightly, calm, like it had made this journey without question. The man looked at Ethan with the same steady gaze as before, not searching, not judging, just present. "You did not finish it," he said, glancing briefly toward the shallow grave behind Ethan. Ethan followed his gaze, then looked back. "Some things can wait," he replied. The man nodded once. As if that answer had been expected, he reached into the small satchel at his side and withdrew something wrapped in cloth, worn but carefully folded, and held it out, not tossing it, not extending it fully, just offering it across the space between them. Ethan stepped forward, taking it without a word, the fabric rough against his palm, carrying the faint scent of smoke and something older, something that had traveled farther than he had. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a small object inside, simple, but crafted with care, a piece of metal shaped into a pendant, marked with symbols he did not recognize but somehow understood were not meant for decoration. He looked up, a question forming before he spoke, but the man answered it before it could be asked. "It belonged to the one who made the promise," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet weight. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the pendant, something in his chest shifting in a way he could not name. "My mother," he said, not asking, just placing the thought where it had already settled. The man inclined his head. "She was found on the edge of our land many winters ago," he said. "Alone, sick, and close to being lost." Ethan felt the ground steady beneath him, not moving, but deeper somehow, like it had just revealed something buried beneath it. "She was given shelter," the man continued, his eyes never leaving Ethan's, "and in return, she gave her word that her blood would one day return that kindness, not in wealth, not in power, but in choice." The words settled into the air between them, not loud, not heavy, but permanent. Ethan looked down at the pendant again, the weight of it far greater than its size. "I did not know," he said quietly. The man gave a faint, almost invisible smile. "Most promises are not made for those who hear them," he replied, then turned his horse slightly, not in dismissal, but in completion. "But they are always kept," he added, and with that, he guided the horse away. No rush, no hesitation, just movement across the land that had already changed. Ethan stood there, the pendant resting in his hand, the sun higher now, casting light across everything that had been shadowed before. And for the first time since the knock on his door, he understood, not everything, not the whole story, but enough to know that what had happened was not slucher, not chance. It was something carried across years, across people, across choices made in moments no one thought would matter. And as he closed his hand around the pendant, the wind moved once more across the land, softer now, like it had finished saying what it needed to say, and would not need to repeat it again. The pendant did not feel heavy in Ethan's hand, but it stayed there longer than it should have, like it had found a place it recognized. He stood on the porch long after the older man disappeared, the shape of him fading into the same horizon that had brought him there, and the land returned to stillness once again, but not the kind of stillness Ethan had known before. This one carried memory, quiet but present, like something watching without needing to be seen. He turned the pendant over, slowly between his fingers, tracing the carved lines that meant nothing to him and everything at the same time. Then he stepped back inside the cabin, closing the door with a softer touch than usual, as if the wood itself had become part of something worth respecting. The fire had gone down to embers, glowing faint against the dim interior. He crouched and added a piece of wood, watching as the flame caught slowly, building from nothing into something steady, the way most things out here began. Small and unnoticed until they were not. He stood and placed the pendant on the table for a moment, just to see it there, out of his hand. But even that felt temporary, like it did not belong to the wood any more than it had belonged to the dust. Outside, the wind moved again, carrying a distant call of birds returning to their patterns, the world moving forward like it always did. But Ethan did not move with it just yet. His eyes drifted to the corner where she had stood, and something about that empty space held more meaning now than the rest of the room combined. He walked over slowly, stopping where she had been, and looked down. The floorboards marked lightly with dust from her boots, faint but still there, a trace of something that had already passed but had not completely left. He let out a breath, quieter than before, and turned back toward the door, something in him pulling him outside again. Not urgency, not concern, just a need to see the land one more time with whatever had changed inside him. He stepped out into the sunlight, brighter now, stretching across the open ground with a clarity that left no room for shadows to hide. The marks in the dirt had begun to fade already, the wind smoothing over what had been left behind, but not completely, not yet. And as he walked forward, he noticed something he had missed before, a single set of prints that did not follow the others away, smaller, lighter, leading just a few steps off to the side before stopping entirely, as if someone had paused there, just for a second. He followed them slowly, each step measured, until he reached the place where they ended, and there, resting in the dust, was something small, almost too simple to notice, a strip of cloth, worn and folded, not dropped carelessly, but placed. He bent down and picked it up, turning it over in his hand, the fabric soft from use, carrying the faint scent of the same smoke and earth he had noticed before, and something else, something warmer, something that lingered just beneath the surface. He did not need to ask where it came from. He already knew. He stood there for a long moment, the cloth in one hand, the memory of the pendant still in the other, and for the first time since all of this began, he felt something shift in a way that was not about the past, not about what had been carried to him, but about what would come next. He looked out across the land again, the same wide stretch of quiet, but no longer empty, not to him. And as the wind moved gently across the ground, it carried no warning this time, no tension, just a calm that settled deeper than before, like something had been acknowledged and accepted. And Ethan understood, without needing it spoken, that whatever promise had found him here had not ended when the riders left. It had only been passed forward, and now it was his to carry, not as a burden, but as something quieter, something that would shape the choices he made long after the dust had settled again. He closed his hand around the strip of cloth and turned back toward the cabin, the door still open, waiting, just as it had been the night before. And as he stepped inside, the light followed him in, filling the space in a way that felt different now, like the place itself had changed along with him. And though nothing had been said, nothing had been promised out loud, the land, the silence, and the memory of that night held something steady beneath it all, something that would not fade, even when no one was there to see it. The day moved forward the way it always did, slow and steady, the sun climbing higher until the shadows shortened and the heat began to settle into the ground. But something beneath it all had shifted, and Ethan could feel it in the way the silence no longer pressed against him. It stayed with him, like a presence that did not need to speak. He stood inside the cabin for a while, the strip of cloth still in his hand, the pendant resting on the table where he had left it, and for a moment he simply looked at them. Two small things, neither worth much to anyone passing through. But together they carried something that had crossed years and distance to find him. He reached for the pendant again, lifting it carefully, then set the cloth beside it, side by side, not because they belonged together, but because something in him said they should not be kept apart. Outside, the wind moved gently, brushing across the land with no urgency, no warning, just the quiet rhythm of a place that had already decided what it was. Ethan stepped back out onto the porch once more, not searching this time, not expecting riders or voices, just looking, taking in the stretch of land that had been his for years and yet somehow felt newly given. The fence line in the distance stood the same. The dry grass bent the same way under the breeze. The sky opened wide above it all without care or judgment, and still, it meant something different now, not because the land had changed, but because he had. He walked down from the porch slowly, boots pressing into the same ground that had held the weight of so many horses just hours before, and though most of the marks had faded, he could still see enough to remember, enough to understand that what had happened here would not be forgotten, not by those who had turned away, and not by him. He stopped near the shallow grave again, the hole still waiting, the shovel resting beside it where he had left it, and for a long moment he simply stood there, looking down, not with the same heaviness as before, but with something quieter, something steadier. He bent and picked up the shovel, turning it once in his hands, then drove it into the earth again, not with urgency, not with anger, just with purpose, each motion deliberate, each movement grounded in something that no longer felt like it needed to be explained. The work continued slowly, the dirt shifting, the shape of the ground changing bit by bit, and as he worked, the memory of the night did not fade. It settled, becoming part of the rhythm instead of something separate from it. Time passed in that quiet way it does out here, marked only by the movement of the sun and the sound of steel meeting earth. And when he finally stopped, the grave was no longer shallow, no longer waiting. It had been finished, not in the same way he had intended before, but in the way it needed to be now. He stepped back, resting the shovel against the ground, his eyes lifting once more toward the horizon. And in that moment, there was no tension there, no expectation, just open space stretching as far as he could see. And something in him understood that this land would not be crossed the same way again, not because of fences, not because of warnings, but because of what had been witnessed here, what had been chosen here. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, the door still open, just as it had been when everything began. And as he stepped inside, the light followed him in, settling across the table where the pendant and the cloth rested side by side, quiet and unchanged, yet carrying everything that had passed between darkness and dawn. Ethan paused there for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the wood, and though no words were spoken, no promises made aloud, something had already been set into place, something that would remain long after the tracks had disappeared and the wind had moved on. And as the door closed behind him, not with force but with certainty, the land outside returned to its silence, but it was no longer empty. It held the memory of a night when a man chose to open his door, and by morning, the world around him chose to remember it.